It's a delight to be here, and I'm amazed at the size of the audience. So my working hypothesis, till I heard that it was a class and people need to show up, was that due to the heat, rational choice theory meant we rushed to a cool room to enjoy the noon hour, which is very sensible decision making. Be it as it may, my name is Crister Garrett. I earned my PhD at UCLA a few years ago. I started my career actually at the former Monterey Institute. I was here for a few years, and then went on to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I ran the European Studies program, and got a Fulbright chair in Leipzig, Germany. Met my future wife there, and as these things work, a sneaky East German woman kept me in Europe, and I'm very happy she did. So that's a little bit about my story. You see the title of what we're going to talk about. First, I'd like to give some thank yous to Professor Anna Vasilyeva for the invitation. We've known each other for quite a few years. And to Edith Bursak and Sarah for all the organizational work and everything that you've done to make this happen. So the origins of this talk and Anna's orders, as I put it. Anna and I have had several conversations through the years about what drives decision making in foreign policy and security policy, and thinking about material considerations, or in other words, notions of national interest based on whether it's oil or coal or steel or physical security, if you will, versus notions of culture and national identities, and that influences decision making. We've had several, especially about Germany and Russia. So we've been having this intellectual conversation for a bit. And then, of course, we've had several developments in German-Russian relations that have, created global headlines, whether Ukraine or Syria or the EU per se, or transatlantic relations in terms of the United States and Germany. So Anna's request, Anna doesn't give orders, she's extremely polite, but Anna's request was that I please discuss the evolution in German thinking about thinking and policy making towards Russia. In other words, what's happening in the German debates about Russia and what are the implications? Why does it matter? So maybe that's the first thing I should really deal with up front, and that is, why should Germany matter for this program? That's a question we should all be able to answer relatively clearly before we get started. Why bother with this? Besides the fact that Germany is a powerful actor in Europe, so how does that really matter? First thing I would say is, I'm not an expert in Russia. I don't read Russian, correct me if I'm wrong, but for everything I can read in English about contemporary Russian security policy and global strategy, and what we see in Germany in terms of Berlin and Moscow and interactions, is that Germany really is a gateway for Russian strategy towards Europe. So where Germany goes much of the EU. We see that in Euro politics. We see that in transatlantic politics. Germany is the new power in Europe. And we can talk about that if you want to. It's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's an observation. And if we look at, for example, a line I use in explaining American foreign policy to Europe, and especially in Germany, the fact that Kerry has visited Berlin far more than he's visited Brussels or Beijing. He's regularly flying through Berlin for personal visits to coordinate transatlantic and also global politics. Moscow understands that. And so in terms of the European Union and where the European Union is going to go vis-a-vis the United States and in global politics, Germany is the gateway for Russia to be able to influence and shape transatlantic and global politics. We see that in many different ways today. In that sense, Germany is a linchpin for U.S.-Russian relations. Washington, D.C. understands very well that where Germany goes, thus goes also much of European politics. It was also true in the Cold War, of course, physically. We saw that with the divided Berlin as the epicenter, arguably, of the Cold War, at least in its European context. And I would argue even today we can say that if we look at the Ukraine crisis, for example, and the degree to which the Obama administration has relied on, has outsourced transatlantic politics vis-a-vis Ukraine to Berlin, I think that's a good measure of this observation about Germany being a linchpin for U.S.-Russian relations. And then lastly, in terms of global security and 21st century architectures of international order, Moscow sees Berlin as one of the new global actors that will shape the global order for trade, the global order for security architecture, whether it's the United Nations or other forms of architecture for global order, especially in terms of norms and institutions. So I would argue for the graduate graduate initiative in Russian studies, Germany is interesting because so much of Russian policy runs through Berlin in trying to influence regional and global politics. That's why it matters. So here's my basic thesis, and I'm watching the clock, and if I run out of time, we can sort of elaborate it later. The prism through which Germany has perceived Russia, and previously the Soviet Union, has been recently fractured. Developments in inter alia, Ukraine, Syria, and the Russian state society have triggered a contested debate in Germany about how to interpret Russian politics and policies and their implications for Germany, Europe, and international order. The largely intact prism of the post-Cold War era through which Germany perceived Russian politics and policy has given way to a fractured and contested debate about how to comprehend the intentions of Moscow regionally and internationally. At stake is the evolution of Germany's culture of security and practices of international politics and policymaking. Moscow is keenly aware of the intense debate underway in Germany and seeks to influence it via diverse strategies. At the end of the day, the Kremlin understands that its ability to shape the future course of Eurasian, transatlantic, and global security politics will be informed importantly by the emerging consensus in Berlin about how to read and react to Russian international initiatives. Okay, I know this is a graduate program in policy and practice and not a PhD program in IR or what have you, but a couple of sort of general observations. I think it's important also at the MA level in thinking about how policy gets made and the relationship between concept and constructing policy. Does domestic politics matter when thinking about national interests in international politics? Big debate among scholars, to what extent it does, if it does, how it does. So you understand where my assumptions are. I think it clearly does. Domestic politics is fundamental to understanding foreign policy or international politics. Two quick examples to sort of put a little meat on the bone in terms of that. One is Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, and the high price of the sentence, das schaffen wir. The German version of yes, we can. And she uttered that in terms of the recent refugee crisis and sort of, if you will, the surge of refugees coming into Europe, into Germany. And her sort of courageous or critical statement that Europe can accept a much larger number of refugees as a humane act, as a sensible act, and has the wealth and infrastructure to do so. It's going to be a classic case study of leadership getting ahead of public consensus for policy. She has lost 30% in public opinion polls. Her party is deeply fractured. Many people argue that sentence and those politics have opened up room for a new populist party that is surging in German national politics, the so-called alternative for Germany. And so we see here what happens when leadership gets ahead of domestic willingness to pursue policy. You need domestic consensus to pursue an ambitious policy. The flip side is Putin, Ukraine, and the surge in popular support for that policy and the consensus around that. We'll see where that is in a year or two or three or what have you. But what we've seen in the last 2 years, there's a flip side of Angela Merkel in the sense of public support for an ambitious foreign policy agenda and how that allows power to be consolidated and practiced. So that observation leads to a couple of important concepts for my presentation. One is the notion of cultures of security. I use culture not in the sense of cross-cultural communication and in sort of a formalistic sense, but culture in an anthropological sense. Traditions, norms, practices, institutions that shape the framing for communication and policy choice, and how that in turn shapes what we can call security environments. Security environments being the relationship between material considerations, whether oil or other aspects of power, hard power, institutions, whether they're domestic political institutions like parliaments or executive authority or international ones such as the OSCE or UN, and normative considerations. What kind of security architecture do we want to create in terms of transparency, interdependency, balance of power, depending on what your agenda is. These things interact to create what we can call a security environment. And this in turn creates, if you will, a relationship between identities, interests, and policymaking. There's not a linear logic here. Identities shape interests, and interests shape identities, and they interact and inform the process of policymaking. Those are my theoretical assumptions that I work with. You have other schools you can see in terms of realists or liberals or constructivists or many other approaches, gender, and you know all about this. But I just want to lay that out there from where this talk is coming from and some of the conceptual and theoretical underpinnings. So, on this order, to sort of elaborate a little bit German readings of contemporary Russia. What I call fractal politics, borrowing from a Princeton historian, Sidney Wirtz, who's written a book about fractal politics in the United States. I think it's a good image, a good metaphor for thinking about some of these issues. Broadly speaking, you could say it's always relative, of course, and broad observations. You could say you had relatively intact prisms during the Cold War. East looking west, west looking east, relatively stable perceptions of sort of geopolitical order and security interests, relatively. You can take that apart and have a long discussion about that. But what the French call la longue durée, in terms of sort of the broad, longer picture, you can say relatively intact. Certainly compared to today would be my argument, is my argument. And then in the post-Cold War period, you could say you also had emerging a relatively intact, identifiable post-Cold War prism through which Germany looked at Russia and European politics. Integration of Russia into a European system of order, helping Russia find its place in global politics, dialogue, diplomacy, really, if you will, a post-Cold War version of détente and integration. That at least was the German narrative of itself and what it sought with Russia, and through which it's looked at Russia and then what should frame German politics towards Russia. What we have now is what I call cracks and contested narratives. We really have an open debate in Germany right now about how to read Russia. There's domestic political competition going on, and the outcomes are uncertain that's going on. This has different causes: rise of German power, growing German confidence, the relative fracturing of Europe and the EU, the disengagement of the United States in transatlantic politics, relative disengagement, the immediacy of new security threats, whether around the Middle East or in the East or globally. All these different factors combine to create notions of insecurity in German political debates, space for a less pressure to have a unified German security narrative, and much more open debate. Roughly speaking, you can break it into 4 schools of thought. You can add more, you can take one out, but I would say this captures most of the debate and the underlying essentials. First is the German Handelsstaat, trading state, trade state theory. Germany, 2/3 of German economic growth comes from exports. If you look at the German economy overall, exports plays a vastly larger role than it does for the United States. The United States is not a Handelsstaat. It's a large, relatively intact market where exports are important, but don't drive growth the way they do fundamentally for Germany and its place in the global economy as one of the world's leading economies. This is very important because the Russian market is fundamental to German economic interests. When Barack Obama flies to Moscow, there's maybe a dozen CEOs in the plane with him. When Angela Merkel flies to Moscow, there's over 100 CEOs. And we're not talking small companies. We're talking Siemens, Mercedes-Benz, Bayer, BASF, and companies like this that are global actors. So this shapes very much how Germany looks at Russia, not in a Leninist, imperialist export market that needs to be dominated, but in terms of economic interdependence and the importance of Russia for the German economy. The second school is what I call East German legacies. So the former East, where Leipzig is in, the state of Saxony, used to be part of East Germany. And really the socialization, the acculturation that came with being in one bloc, if you will, during the Cold War, and how voters in the East have really a different relationship to Russia, importantly because of that. Part of this is sociological. Young Germans in the former East, about 20... Eastern Germany represents about 20 million of the 82 million German citizens. So it's an important part, but it's a minority. But it's a constituency, and an important one. And particularly among older Germans, there's deep unease about what's happening in German-Russian relations right now. And strong calls, strong protests for the current Angela Merkel line, and a call for much more dialogue, the end of sanctions, for example, against Russia. NATO must pull back from Eastern Europe. These are some of the concrete policy implications from this narrative and reading of Russia. Germany should redefine its interests much more strongly towards the East and away from what's seen as American. The word bullying is even used in this narrative. And of course, Putin's time in Dresden is always talked about, and his biography, his personal biography, and the role that that plays. Another big camp, and this is really the one that Angela Merkel and for example, the German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier, you have what's called a grand coalition in Germany right now. The chancellor belongs to the Christian Democratic Union, sort of a center-right party. In the United States, it would probably be a Hillary Clinton sort of narrative. And the foreign minister or the secretary of state is Frank-Walter Steinmeier. He's from the Social Democratic Party, but he's very centrist too, a center-left member. And for them, this idea of Europe's role in the world, in German, a Gestaltungsmacht, that's a new word that's becoming part of the German vocabulary. And what it means is to be a sufficiently robust power to shape global politics, to have the means, the material means, and have both the hard and soft power to shape global and regional politics. This is important because for Angela Merkel and Frank-Walter Steinmeier, what's happening in terms of Syria or Ukraine or Russian state and society, and Germany and Europe's reaction will shape how Germany and Europe are perceived in global politics. Read Beijing, read India, read Washington, D.C., and their ability to articulate an agenda, to pursue an agenda, and to pursue it effectively. So for them, Russia is about a global wager, if you will, about influence and power in the 21st century. That's the narrative that is used to read German-Russian relations right now. And the fourth one, is what I call the Aus Politik narrative. And I put there in parentheses Germany's only Nobel Peace Prize. To give you a sense of the relationship between prestige, influence, power, emotional pull of certain narratives. The former German Chancellor Willy Brandt, Social Democrats, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973 for his Détente initiative called Aus Politik, which was the idea that to create new political room for dialogue and détente, in other words, the relaxation of tensions, the West could pursue a strategic initiative towards the Soviet Union to try to create just that, space for dialogue, political space for dialogue, and trying to reduce tensions. And for this initiative, Aus Politik initiative, Willy Brandt is the only German chancellor to have won the Nobel Peace Prize. That matters in German political culture. It's about prestige, it's about legacies. And so Aus Politik is a key component of the German foreign policy vocabulary in terms of thinking about Russia and how to read Russia. So what are some implications from these different competing narratives currently in the German domestic political landscape for possible sort of conclusions that bridge these contested narratives within the German domestic political landscape? One is that, and this you find across the German political landscape, Europe's future cannot be separated from Russia. Russia is existential for Germany and for European security and stability. Two, Germany's future, I have existence in here because of the power of memory. The power of memory of World War II and the Cold War depends on a stable Russia. This is why the German debate about Russia and the future of Russia and how to read Russia is so existential in the German domestic political landscape in terms of the consequences. And lastly, and that's the context I'm going to try to weave in here, Germany can only lose with a Russian-American conflict. See Aus Politik. Aus Politik was in many ways Willy Brandt's effort to create space between the United States and Russia to try to get us out of the nuclear competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, in the sense that the German political class was deeply worried about where Soviet-U.S. relations were heading at that time. So what I want to talk a little bit now about is how out of these different narratives we get a certain vocabulary for policy making. So I got a lot of weird German words up here. I don't know if anyone here knows German, but the point of it is we're at the Middlebury, Monterey model, if you will, is to concretely really talk about how language really does shape logics and narratives that feed directly into policy frames and ultimately policy making. So I have here a small sample of words that one reads again and again in German debates and analyses of policy towards Russia, how to read Russia, and how to build transatlantic politics. Vergangenheitsbewältigung. This is one of these big conglomerate words in German. It means sort of not mastering of the past, but really engaging the past. That the past is fundamental for understanding choices we have today. And of course, in a German-Russian context, I don't have to talk long about that. Regularly in the German press, you see commemorations of past events, battles, dealing with World War II, etc. I would say, looking at this globally, the German culture and practice of memory is vastly different than what we see happening, let's say, in Japan, for example, in terms of World War II. If you're looking for a global sort of comparative exercise in how cultures of memory matter, compare and contrast Japan and Germany. I'm not saying Germany has it right, far from it. But Germany takes how memory impacts contemporary policy frames very seriously. And this is central to its vocabulary about how to think and read Russia. Aus Politik I've talked about. Entspannungspolitik. That's the German version of détente, from the French verb détendre, to relax. And it's at the core of how Germany looks at policy options. How do we take the tension out of the situation? What can we do in terms of policy choice? So Entspannungspolitik is a key word. Vermittler is another word. This means sort of a mediator, to play a medium role. So if we look concretely at Germany, Russia, the United States, Germany is very well aware that it's the third party. It's the small party in this dialogue. But what it sees itself being able to do, because of its power, and its increasing power, is to create frames and options for Russia and the United States that can be interesting, and maybe even worth considering further. This is the legacy of Aus Politik. Willy Brandt and his team came to Washington, D.C., talked to Richard Nixon and to Henry Kissinger, who were deeply skeptical of this idea. They saw some sort of effort by West Germany and social democrats to push NATO east, to sort of weaken NATO resolve in terms of the Cold War. So they were deeply suspicious initially, Nixon and Kissinger, about Aus Politik. And it took Willy Brandt to really make clear what the intentions of Aus Politik were, to create new space for political initiative, that finally Kissinger and Nixon, first Kissinger, then Nixon, finally signed off on that initiative. So that Vermittler concept is at the anchor where Germany sees how it can practice power, especially between great powers. Rechtsstaat. So this means sort of the state of law, the notion of law. International law in Germany, because of Weimar and the trauma of Weimar and the collapse of law, has a fundamental sense. This is really what drives now, at least publicly, Angela Merkel's position on Ukraine and Russia and sanctions. That this was a break of international law, and that is unacceptable in the 21st century. You can obviously debate that, but what I'm trying to get across here is the centrality of this notion is in the DNA of German security culture. Ordnungspolitik is another basic concept along these lines. That means systems of order and maintaining systems of order. Again, post-Weimar, post-World War II trauma in Germany. Now this has become embedded in how it looks at the United Nations, OSCE, China's behavior in the Pacific, Russia's behavior in the Eurasian area, American behavior in different instances. So this is something that is beyond discussion. It's sort of at the core of German security culture and vocabulary. Primat der Politik, that means politics above else. So you don't hear Germans talking about deploying military power. You'll hear them talking a lot about dialogue and politics. So a military vocabulary in Germany is not perhaps as taboo as it still is in Japan. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But it's largely absent from German debates about both Russia and global politics. So Dialogue and Diplomatie, I've sort of talked about that. Zivilmacht is important. Germany still sees itself largely as a so-called civilian power. It is not integrated into its security culture. It certainly has the wealth to do so, and it has the technology to do so, to build a world-class military. And Germany's at the beginning of a debate about what it needs in the next 10 to 20 years. So like Japan, it has the wealth and it has the technology, but it does not have the political consensus to go further down that road. And it's just not there yet. And then I talked about Gestaltungsmacht, so the power to shape and pursue international politics, to be a player, in a colloquial phrase, and to use that to shape regional and global politics. So language, logics, and policy frames, this is obviously too linear, but the point here is that memory shapes political cognition, emotion, and rationality. Memory shapes what we mean. What is rational politics? What do we mean by rational choice in the context of rationality? Which informs political cultures, in other words, the practice of politics and the construction of policy. And lastly, as I put here, ultimately the policy frames in which that we shape. In other words, language shapes identities, identities shape interests, interests feed back into identities. And we have a full loop here. So what are the policy implications? Let me see if I can sort of show what this all means in a less abstract level. Am I doing okay on time?
Yep, you're good.
All right. Three forms of security that we can talk about and look at how this feeds into it and how Germany reads Russia and sort of the politics around this. Energy security, economic security, and territorial security. Three types of security. Energy security. The former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder is on the advisory board of Gazprom, has been involved in Russian-European energy politics for quite some time, deeply controversial in German politics. Some people support that, some people strongly criticize that, and was instrumental in what Angela Merkel also supports, the so-called Nord Stream gas pipeline that runs from Russia through the Baltic directly to a German port, bypassing Ukraine and Poland. So for Ukraine and Poland, this brings up the worst images of Russian-German policy being made over the heads or literally around Central and Eastern Europe. Okay? And Polish and Ukrainian and Eastern European leadership has said so openly. In Germany, has earned strong criticism at one of the premier sort of transatlantic forum where these issues are looked at, the so-called Munich Security Conference, Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz, Munich Security Conference. If you're interested in seeing sort of the politics around that, they have a website in English, Munich Security Conference. And you can see speeches by Putin and Medvedev and many other Russian personalities in German. It's a good source to get at sort of perceptions in politics. And energy security is so fundamental here because Americans have been strongly critical of German policy towards Russia. Germany has countered that to engage Russia and to create purposeful interdependencies, Gazprom and Nord Stream are essential. We're sort of dependent on each other. The countercharge is that Germany is giving up certain forms of sovereignty, can be blackmailed by Russia in terms of energy policy. That's a charge that the German political class is sensitive about. But ultimately, Germany is not going to change the Nord Stream policy. Nord Stream is going to go online. It's going to be a new fundamental gas line that's going to be part of the European energy mix. But it makes Germans very nervous. They understand it leads to a type of dependency on Russian politics and Russian energy strategy, geoeconomics and geopolitics. So we see tension and fragility here. The next one is economic security. The issue of sanctions, deeply controversial in Germany. At the end of the day, though, the current Merkel government supports them. Germany will have elections next year. They might possibly have a so-called, right now they have a so-called red-black coalition. That means a combination of Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, center-left, center-right. Depending on how elections occur next year, Germany might have a so-called red-green coalition. That means clearly more left in terms of its politics. We'll see what that means for sanctions. To give you a sense of the power of Germany right now, if Germany calls for the end of sanctions, sanctions die in terms of the EU. There's no one else there to hold them up, especially with Great Britain whenever it leaves the EU. But with Great Britain really no longer at the table informing EU strategy. Germany is the linchpin for sanctions remaining in place. So if the government changes there, sanctions are gone. And of course, Moscow is deeply aware of that. Overall, on the other hand, for Germany, as I talked about before, as a Handelsstaat, as a trading nation, Russia and its place in terms of Eurasian markets, in terms of South Central Asia, in terms of China, in terms of Russia, in terms of integrating markets, Belarus, is enormously interesting and important for Germany. So there's a very competitive, contested debate going on in Germany right now around what do we mean by economic security? And the trade-offs between Rechtsstaat, in other words, the notion of upholding international law. What do we mean by interest? Interest, the definition of interest, are very fluid and competitive right now. And you see that in German politics. And the outcomes are uncertain. But we have a very dynamic debate going on there. Territorial security. Hybrid warfare has become the new concept in the debate about what we mean by territorial security. Hybrid warfare means a combination of informal units, information warfare, tactical incursions into territory, the effort to destabilize members of an alliance. And Germany, frankly, doesn't know quite what to do with this. It is observing this. It is debating these issues. Germany now, for example, has started a new fund to help Baltic states and Ukraine in terms of media and media reliability. That's a completely new quality for Germany. It's Germany assuming that some power, that's how the Germans put it, some power is meddling with domestic media channels in the Baltic states and in Ukraine, and putting substantial money behind the efforts by Baltic states and Ukraine and other states to create reliable and diverse media outlets and information. And by robust funding, I mean to the tune of $100 million plus. So it's not a polite program, it's a substantial program. And this has really led to big shifts in sort of the perception and also the controversy of NATO in German security politics and cultures of security. We see Germany being willing to support a new NATO headquarters on the Polish-German border. Unthinkable 5 years ago. Unthinkable 5 years ago. And that shows you how cultures evolve depending on inputs into a security environment and reactions to those inputs and the evolution of the security environment. That's a good institutional measuring of how cultures of security are not static, they're not monolithic, they exist, but they're also dynamic and can evolve. And you see that in just a micro reading of NATO and the evolution of NATO. NATO itself is still deeply controversial in Germany. If we look at East German legacies, for example, a clear majority of former East Germans, people living in what was formerly East Germany, do not support NATO. 60% of Germans do not support Article 5, or say that Article 5 can be read different ways, which is true. If you read Article 5, it says each member state to the best of its ability will support other members. So it's also open for interpretation. So NATO is controversial in terms of German self-perceptions of solidarity, of institutional alliances and security embeddedness, and where the country needs to go. All these issues, energy security, economic security, and territorial security, are read, and policy is constructed in what I call a multi-level frame, and context. Russian, European, transatlantic, and global. That might seem a little confusing, but I want to give you a sense of these are not binary calculations. And these are not multilateral in the sense of 2 or 3 partners. Henry Kissinger once said about Germany, poor Germany, too large to be a peaceful European power, too small to be a global power. And as a former German and has studied European systems of security, he knows a thing or two about these issues. His point was that when Germany makes a decision vis-a-vis Russia or the EU, it has larger implications beyond the immediate neighborhood. So take Nord Stream, for example, just as one example. This has deep implications for German-Russian relations, but it has also profound consequences for European integration. It has created greater mistrust between the Polish and Ukrainian political classes in Berlin and in Scandinavia. Berlin is seen as being willing to practice zero-sum calculations. Up until Nord Stream or this area, the general feeling was Germany would only undertake initiatives if it was clearly a win-win for all parties. Because of World War II, the legacies of World War II. Nord Stream serves German national interests. Germany doesn't say so clearly, but that is the conclusion by Warsaw, by Kiev, by Helsinki, Stockholm, and capitals around Germany. So Germany has to think very carefully about the trade-offs between Russian, European, transatlantic in terms of the United States. The standard line in German security culture is the United States is Germany's most important partner outside of Europe. So the U.S. is fundamental to how Germany calculates its national interests. So it has to think very carefully about reactions from Washington, D.C. And then lastly, globally, in terms of Germany is deeply aware, as I said before, anything that it does in terms of Russia is being followed in Beijing extremely carefully. What does that say in terms of what Germany is willing to pay in terms of political capital to pursue not just interests, but a notion of a liberal order or an international order per se? What assets is it willing to expend for that system? Beijing is watching that very, very carefully. So Moscow and Berlin and Beijing, this is how you can also read how Germany reads Russia. So I want to put in the global context, or certainly Washington, D.C., in terms of talking about this. You can't separate these issues. I have maybe about a couple more minutes.
You're still good.
Yeah?
You can keep going.
Yeah? All right. So some institutional embedding. Military power for Germany, like I said, is still very controversial. Military budgets, the defense budgets in Germany are slowly going up, but it's mostly for personnel. It's not for hardware. Germany's trying to make the notion of a career in the military more attractive. It needs people in the military for security. So you see the shift taking place in Germany in terms of how it defines security, more material emphasis and a little less institutional, let alone sort of notions of peace politics. That being said, if you take, say, 4 examples, institutionalism or institutions are fundamental to Germany. If you were an academic, if I had been a German academic and I wanted to be a professor at a German university back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, for me to be a standard IR, international relations realist, like hundreds of American scholars during the Cold War and during the 1990s, I wouldn't have found work. I wouldn't have found work in German academia. Not in East Germany, anyways, but I'm talking about West Germany. I would have been seen as someone who believes in balance of power, the importance of military power, the importance of alliances, and that was not part of the West German narrative and perception of self after World War II, during the Cold War, and really until, I would say, arguably up until about 5 years ago. That is slowly changing now. But the point is, civil power and institutionalism has been sort of the backbone of German culture security. Where you can see that as an institution like the OSCE. Germany was at the heart of changing the CSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, sort of a relatively semi-formal institution during the Cold War, into an international organization, the organization. That's fine print, you might say, and irrelevant. But Germany has the presidency of the OSCE and has invested enormously in the OSCE. Has a very ambitious agenda. The NATO-Russia Council. Germany is by far the most robust voice calling for the NATO-Russia Council to play a larger role, and steadily is doing so. More so than the United States, more so than any other country. European Union. The European Union is for Germany existential. There's going to be no Brexit. There's not going to be no Grexit. That's the Greek version, but the German version of Grexit. The EU is fundamental for German material interests. And to put it in a sentence, for Angela Merkel and for Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the German foreign minister. The only way that Germany and the EU are, in terms of long term, could be able to shape Russian policy, maybe Chinese policy, maybe American policy, is via the EU. That's where the assets are. Germany on its own is too small, and the rest of the EU is irrelevant, frankly. The famous line from Stalin to de Gaulle, tell me how many divisions you have again? Thank you for this conversation. Germany understands that. And so for Merkel, for the center of German politics, for Europe to have a credible role at the global table of politics in the 21st century, the EU has to have an integrated economy. It has to have some form of cohesive security policy. And it has to develop some kind of ability to deploy hard power. And then the last point is what I call sort of German-Russian thick institutionalism. Germany invests more in German-Russian institutions than any other European country by far in terms of bilateral institutional cooperation. You see that in parliamentary groups, you see that in higher education, you see that in commerce, you see it across the board. You have a very robust, thick institutional relationship between Germany and Russia, and Germany spends money on that. It spends money on that. That is seen as pursuing vital German interests in terms of dialogue and interdependency and trying to socialize a new generation. All right, 2 minutes. Anna told me also to talk about looking forward. So I'll do it with 3 different models. Then maybe we can talk about that during Q&A. One I call cultural adaptation, where you can see that cultures of security are not static and evolve in terms of material power, in terms of institutions, in terms of normative priorities, is in a snapshot of the German culture of security. In the so-called new Weißbuch. The Weißbuch, or the German White Book, is roughly equivalent to the American national security strategy. Roughly. Okay? Big differences, but to give you a crude comparison. This has just come out. If you type in German White Book 2016, you'll come to a web page that's all in English. There is a 3-minute video that I show my students. 3 minutes. It is a wonderful performance of a country trying to probably convince itself, but also other countries, about how its culture of security is being framed and articulated, and the trade-offs between normative, institutional, material considerations. It's a very interesting video. And I have my students break it down. I have them read it as a text. It's a visual text, but I have them break that down to look at what cultures of security mean, what security environments mean, and what we can sort of read how the German culture of security is evolving. Contingencies. Lots of unknowns. In terms of the German White Book is a plan. It is a frame. How it gets interpreted and deployed depends on different contingencies. And I would say 3 big ones right now, fundamental ones, are Ukraine, Syria, and the readings of Russian state and society. The state that's being built, implications for Russian society, implications for what that means for how Germany engages those developments. Last sentence, what is absolutely core DNA, some things I would argue in cultures of security are harder to change, are a type of DNA in cultures of security, is the phrase you hear in Germany all the time, Dialog sei alternativlos. That means there are no military solutions. That is absolutely embedded in the German culture of security because of the trauma of World War II, the trauma of Weimar. That is not dependent on parties and competition. That is sort of, like I said, part of the DNA of the German culture of security. Diplomacy, dialogue. Hard power capacity, yes, but hard power solutions. This is why you saw Germany not vote in the case of Libya and other issues in terms of Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. Okay, thank you very much for your patience, and I really look forward to your questions and our dialogue together. Thank you.
Thank you. You kind of mentioned Syria just as a contingency, and really I don't think packed it, or kind of pulled out enough of the threads of what's going on there. So my question is, how is the current situation in Syria vis-a-vis Russia affecting this debate about security?
I would say what we're seeing right now is capturing the German imagination. It shows you how contingencies and moments can have longer-term impacts. I mean, the German press right now, across the board, and that's what's important, center-left, center-right, politicians from across the board, are looking at what's happening in Aleppo and the bombings and the developments over, let's say, the last week, and are struggling with how to discuss this and digest this in terms of, is this tactical? Is this a shift? Is it Groznya and the notion of a Russian approach to state security and national interest? And Aleppo is going to be, my prediction is, a type of Srebrenica. It's going to become a code word and an anchor in a narrative about notions of solidarity, peace, the pursuit of security. The debates we had between Madeleine Albright and the European political class around ex-Yugoslavia and what to do in terms of policy. I think this is really shifting the perception, for example, of Barack Obama and American security policy. What was seen as sensible caution and restraint is now being read more as perhaps moral relativity and perhaps indifference. See the fineness of the language and the implications for policy. So, and what you can see here is in terms of as sort of minor minor quakes in the German landscape for politics is, and you see this, and where you also see this is in the socialization of a generation. We're seeing this in polling already. Right? So you can see older Germans, especially from the eastern part of the country, are much more willing to say Russia's just pursuing its interests, Russia has a right for its zone of influence, a certain, might say, Cold War realist read. I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying it's a type of read. Whereas younger Germans, and I find this interesting because you see this a little bit in Japan and Taiwan and elsewhere, in terms of countries recovering from war or trauma, younger Germans are less inclined to be cautious in terms of criticizing Russia. So we see a socialization taking place where younger Germans are willing to say about American behavior, but also Russian behavior, to openly criticize that. That taboo has been broken. That taboo, yeah, in terms of cultures, I think the concept of taboo is important. Martha Finnemore and the work of others in terms of taboos, right? So that German taboo of openly criticizing Russia has been broken. That's happened in part because of Ukraine, but it's happening rapidly now because of Syria. And that's going to have generational implications. And so we'll see what happens. You know, there was strong praise for the deal that Kerry and the Russians put together for some kind of coordination, and dismay at the unraveling and the speed of the unraveling of that coordination. So that's why Syria is so important. A lot of things are running through Syria in terms of German culture of security and its long-term sort of direction.
My name is Rory.
Nice to meet you,
my
Rory.
question is, Germany is one of the most successful and innovative energy sectors in the modern world, and as Germany makes a shift away from fossil fuels to green energy, renewable energy, how is that affecting the relationship with Russia, who is very dependent on oil prices and the fossil fuels?
I mean, as we know, in terms of oil, Germany is. It's a story I follow with great interest, and it's one that you can get a long answer on, but I'll try to keep it short. Gas is a relatively more clean form of energy. So not in terms of how it's necessarily extracted and where it's extracted and all kinds of different things, but in terms of, say, so-called dirty coal, ignite, which Germany burned a lot of, especially in the eastern part. Leipzig almost disappeared as a city, just as a footnote of history. There's an enormous amount of ignite or brown coal or dirty coal under Leipzig, and if the wall had not come down 89, 90, the huge cranes that sort of strip mine were 5 miles outside of Leipzig, and the Communist Party had already given the order to dig right through Leipzig. They didn't care about Leipzig. They wanted access to the brown coal. and it had profound implications for the health of people in the area. My mother-in-law is a doctor, and she said there was an explosion in child diseases, lung-based diseases taking place and things like that. So Germany has, cares about this a lot, and in terms of energy technology, it's very interested, of course, in exporting to Russia in terms of clean energy sources. It's completely gotten rid of nuclear energy, as you know. And in terms of oil, it's still going to need oil. And what it's learning is it's still going to need coal. Because Germany has, like you said, one of the world's most advanced energy sectors, but it also has still deeply dependent on manufacturing and energy-intensive manufacturing, chemical, steel, auto, etc. And so with this so-called Energiewende, sort of the shift in energy policy, energy prices for this industrial economy have risen about 30%. And in terms of globalization, that's enormously challenging. And so where you see all large German firms now placing factories is not a single one in Germany. They're all being placed at different parts of the world, including North America and the United States. It has everything to do with energy politics. So it's very difficult for Germany right now in terms of that. And consumers are also, I see it on my own bill. My energy bill has gone up by 40% in the last 2 years. I know it's for a good cause, but that is 40%. So I told my children there's no presents for Christmas this year. They didn't find that amusing. No, Spaß beiseite. Just kidding. So it's complicated. It's a good question. The Russian energy sector is essentially a dirty one and an outmoded one. It needs vast investment. Germany sees lots of potential there. And in terms of technology, it's vastly ahead of China in terms of being able to help this market. So it's another reason why, as a Handelsstaat, in terms of commerce, it's very interested in keeping these interdependencies there. We'll see where it goes. Germany, now what Germany is doing, now that it's shut down its coal industry, it's exporting coal from different parts of the world. Coal consumption has actually increased in Germany, and it's importing coal from countries where it's being strip mined, where mountaintop strip mining. You don't read that in the German debate in the papers, but that's actually happening. The law of unintended consequences, in part, at least short to medium term. We'll see where we are long term.
So to the extent that it's clear, where do you see the AfD falling in these four categories in terms of their relationship towards Russia and the appeasement to Russia, and to what extent do you see that affecting the sort of mainstream political discourse?
Ben mentioned AfD, that stands for Alternative for Germany in German, Alternative für Deutschland, and that is Germany's new national populist party. And it is surging in polls. And as a sociological phenomenon, it's interesting because you can see this phenomenon in other societies, post-industrial societies. It's Germany's version of Donald Trump. It's Germany's version of the Brexit movement. It's Germany's version of Front National Marine Le Pen in France. It's Germany's version of similar parties throughout Scandinavia. Every Scandinavian country, I sort of say provocatively to my guests in Germany when they criticize me about Donald Trump, I say, but Donald Trump's already in power in almost every Scandinavian country because of parliamentary proportional representation systems. So Alternative for Germany is, what we see happening here is because of migration politics, because in part of politics with Russia, we see the notion of conservative politics, national politics breaking up and new spaces opening. And what's interesting about Alternative for Germany, and you have the exact same sociology in Great Britain, France, Scandinavia, and in the United States. The fact that union members think Donald Trump has a lot of positive things to say, right? What do we mean by left and right? So the Alternative for Germany really is the classic populist movement in the sense that the most support it gets is from the former Communist Party in Germany. That's where it's winning the most votes, taking votes away. Right? So far left, far right are coming together in this movement Alternative for Germany. Classic populist sociology in terms of political movements. So what does it mean in terms of Russia? Well, it means, like you see in most populist movements, contradictory messages. Right? On the one hand, sort of a strongly nationalist message about protecting nationalist interest. Right? So, that means, protecting German culture. against Slavic influence or Anglo-American influence. Okay, so that you might see as sort of a protectionist, not Russophobic, but sort of clearly sort of suspicious of Russian intentions. On the other hand, it's a message that says, because of power and national interests, of course Russia has the right to have a sphere of influence. Of course Russia wants to protect its borders and zone of influence, just like, and you hear this in Donald Trump, right? Putin's a strong leader. Of course Beijing has the right to have a zone of influence in the South China Sea, etc. So what you hear from Donald Trump on terms of China and Russia, you hear surprisingly similar sentences in an alternative for Germany in terms of how to read Russia and Chinese behavior. So the alternative for Germany is polling right now, depending on the poll and the day and everything, between 15 and 20%. We'll have national elections in Germany next fall. My prediction is they'll likely make it into the national parliament. Will they be part of a government? This is the deep fear for everyone. That would be traumatic in terms of German politics, that a national populist party, like in Switzerland, it's already happened in Switzerland, and it's already happened in Austria. So in terms of the so-called German-speaking area of Europe, Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, one of the questions in Europe has been, why hasn't there been a larger, more central, more influential national populist party in Germany like we've seen in Austria and Switzerland? What's held it back? That's a longer answer to talk about afterwards if you want. There's different hypotheses about that. But it's not unrealistic that next year we could experience for the first time where indeed that happens. Germany follows the mold of Great Britain, France, Austria, Switzerland, Scandinavian countries. The Dutch, if you look at it, the Netherlands and their politics. And that would be something that I think there would be long discussions in Moscow how to read that. Opportunity and danger is basically would be the sentence in 2 words.
I enjoyed hearing you talk about how Germany views the relationship with Russia in the context of the Cold War era. How does Germany view their relationships with other former Eastern Bloc countries in that context as well, particularly with regards to NATO as well as the economy or international economic relations?
I'll provide an answer focusing on one country, or mostly on one country, namely Poland. So Leipzig is 2 hours from Poland. So if we look at this space here, Prague is 3 hours away, Krakow is 5 hours away, and the universities in Prague, Krakow, and Leipzig have been partners for centuries. So you have a sort of Central European dynamic. And yet, if you look at the cultures of security of Poland and Germany, they're like from 2 different continents, 2 different planets. Once a month I hold a transatlantic seminar for officers of the German Bundeswehr, the German military. We talk about German-U.S. relations. And I tell them to sort of help them sort of get a sense of it. I said, the Polish culture of security has a lot more to do with Israel than it does with Germany. In terms of never again, right? In terms of notions of weakness, notions of perceptions of weakness, notions of national independence, and what that means. For Poland, NATO membership was much more important than EU membership because of this reason. That shows you how cultures of security and cultures of memory shape practically policy frames and policy strategies. So, and for Poland, you can see interesting moments, you can see darker moments, it's complex. Famous line from the former Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sikorski, held an important speech in 2011 in Berlin. You can look that up and read that. Sikorski, Berlin, 2011, where he said, "We're not afraid of more German power and leadership in Europe. We're afraid of too little German power and leadership in Europe." And that was seen as sort of a caesura. You have a Polish foreign minister coming to Berlin and asking for more German power and leadership. That's a new quality in terms of international politics. It shows you concretely the relation between language, cultures, narratives, and strategic decision-making. Where you can see that where Germany realizes it has to speak to the anxieties of the Baltic states and Poland in terms of the evolving geopolitics of Europe. This was driving a lot of the German decision to support a new NATO brigade and a brigade sort of infrastructure being placed on the German-Polish border. Like I said, unthinkable 5 years ago. Unthinkable. Now it's done, and it's operating. And so in terms of the German political class, they see that Poland will do what is necessary to pursue its national interests, and for it to relativize that and to Europeanize that, Germany has to, Gestaltungsmacht, has to try to shape policy. It's controversial, you can debate that, but that's where you see the implication. So you have Baltic states, you have Poland. The Czech Republic is very tricky. Putin enjoys a large followership, and it shows you how, Czech Republic and Poland are neighbors, right? Putin is enemy number one in Poland. Putin is a very interesting personality in Czech politics. About a third of the electorate think that Russia is being, defamed and portrayed in an unfair light. There's a robust neo-communist movement in the Czech Republic. We know about Hungary and Viktor Orbán and how he's trying to position the country. So when Merkel and Germany, the German political class realizes for Europe to remain intact as a project, you have to deal with this. It's a little bit what Obama says with Congress, right? We can disagree. We have lots of different personalities, but let's work on a larger project, so to speak. Germany realizes it has the means in terms of material power and incentives, and it has the need to try to bring these different sort of voices together. But it's enormously difficult. Austria is also a good country to look at that. So you have different ecosystems, national ecosystems that shape European politics and the notion of European geography. They're different, they're unique. Like I said, Czech Republic, Poland, and Germany. You see three starkly different political ecosystems competing and existing next to each other, shaping European politics. Any critiques? I mean, I said a lot of big generalizations. There's got to be some criticism of that.
When you spoke about, sort of towards the beginning of the lecture, about Germany sort of being a new, now being the major power in Europe, I guess I wondered in what sort of time frame you were talking about, because it seems, I mean, even really with American support since pretty soon after the Second World War, they almost just assumed that role very sort of below the radar, but they had that role of the power in Europe pretty constantly. So
yeah, it's a good observation. Berlin was the epicenter of the Cold War, and was early on, just as you point out correctly. And for Britain, for example, German membership in NATO was critical in terms of give NATO substance and credibility, and so forth and so on. And by the early 70s, the West German economy was recovering so rapidly, along with the Japanese. Those two economies were relativizing American power, global power, consistently and regularly as of at least the early 70s. So you make good observations in terms of that. And German unification, where we've seen ebbs and flows, is that because of German unification, that was such an enormous project. Germany was, understandably or not, deeply self-absorbed with the process of unification and required enormous resources, right? If you think about it, for 80 million people, and actually the integration of 20 million people, the country spent over $1 trillion, close to $2 trillion for 20 million people. Imagine if California had $2 trillion to revamp the California infrastructure, what would happen to this state with its 38 million people? I mean, to give you a sense of the size of the project. So that is seen as relatively now having been digested and completed. Lots of domestic politics around that, but be it as it may. And so that's relativizing itself. And Germany understands, through different things that I won't get into now, if it wants an intact regional or global system of order, both for trade, but also for security in a broader definition, it has to be an active participant. In part, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the German foreign minister, had a piece in Foreign Affairs recently about this, very interesting. He said, in part by default, because if we look at international actors who bring credibility and wherewithal, in other words, resources, to encourage a certain type of international order, who's there? Without naming names, we can France is in a deeply problematic situation right now. Great Britain, we see, is struggling with itself. The United States is not sure where it wants to go. What resources does Russia want to put into a liberal order? It does, but I'm just saying for Germany, it's a little bit unclear. Or China, it's a little bit unclear, at least for Berlin. So, internally, the German political class reached the conclusion, and you see that in the White Book of 2016, we have to deploy more power, and we have the ability to do so. And certainly in terms of Washington, D.C., when Washington, D.C. looks at Europe, it looks at London and sees a place deeply in crisis. It looks at Paris, sees a place deeply in crisis. Italy is in a generational project. So again, for D.C., by default, Berlin is the last capital standing, in a way. And Germany has evolved to the sense that it realizes it's never going to be a United States, but it can play a measurable, significant, central role in encouraging type of liberal order, whatever you want to mean by that.
Anyone else?
My students let me have it back home. I'm like, Garrett, I don't even know where to begin with how wrong you are.
As democracy in Russia is very new, it's only, 16, 15 years old now. They've received a lot of criticism from the West of their media and their elections and all kinds of stuff. Do you see any pressure coming from German policy to kind of hasten up the process, the accepting of more liberal Western democratic ideas and liberal ideology from Europe?
It's a great question because, and I talk a lot to my German colleagues about this, about Germany, for me at least, as a student of international politics, is so interesting because you can literally read on rhetorical and narrative strategies in the German political class what taboos can mean in politics. So I'm going to answer your question by starting in the United States. So, with the NSA affairs and spying and things like that, the German press, when you can say absolutely rightfully so, was appalled at American policy. And from left to right, all German media had no compunction to express that. Deeply critical of American politics, all completely legitimate. And then when I would talk to colleagues and say, do you think that Moscow's not spying in Berlin? Do you really believe that? And do you really believe, for example, the French are not spying? I mean, their embassy is literally right across the street from the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, right? And the French are proud and have an enormously robust tradition of spying. And certainly Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. I said, do you think the French are really not spying in Berlin? Do you really think that here in the German political class when I talk to the Bundestag and members of the German foreign policy establishment? And they're like, yeah, Crister, we can't talk about that, right? So you see the taboos there, right? So German critique of developments in Russia is a linguistic minefield in terms of what's permissible and not permissible, right? So, but what you see shifting here, and again shows a shift in the culture of security and the practice of security, is an increasing willingness to critique what's seen, if it's fair or not, but what's seen as Putin's effort to reduce space for civil society, for non-state actors. So, and you see that in German policy. I was at a meeting where it was about the four-power treaty and the unification of Germany, and those who had sort of negotiated that treaty back in '90, all the Russian actors and the British were all there. And Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the German foreign minister, held a speech. And what really struck me about that speech, I was in the room so I could see the performance, was how Walter Steinmeier was really willing to turn to his Russian colleagues and say, what's happening right now is unacceptable. For me, that was a new quality. For a senior German practitioner of security policy, to talk to, he was civil and polite about it, but the point is he was very clear in his language. There was no hedging whatsoever. To me, that's a new quality in the relationship. Reflects German confidence. Maybe other things too. And we'll see what it means in terms of Russian society and politics. So, Germany and Europe are very clear that democracy becomes practiced in different countries in different ways. You know, we can have a long discussion about democracy and institutions and what that means. I think a basic minimal thing is the perception that an effort is made for free and open elections, and there is a possibility of the opposition coming to power. I think that's a definition that most scholars of democracy would agree with. And when you look at Russia today, it's hard to find those criteria being met. And so that minimal level is something that Germany is willing to talk about in certain institutions, for example, right? European institutions, European, Court of Justice, European Human Rights Commission, institutions in which Russia and Germany are members. So, but Germany is very cautious about, there is no German State Department report criticizing Russian human rights or political practice. Germans don't do that. They see it as kind of frankly, an irrelevant exercise and an unproductive exercise. So when Obama called, for example, Russia a regional power, Germany reacted very quickly. Dumb. Just dumb. Whatever you want to think about that, but that was swift and across the board in the German political. Why practice such a generalized form of public critique? So we can have a discussion about that, moral authority, speak truth to power, and different things like that. You can have a real debate about that. But in terms of Russia, Germany is very cautious in terms of that. But that caution is eroding in the contingency of different developments that we talked about.
Could you talk more about the German relationship with Russia over Ukraine, particularly in the ways that, do you see as much pushback from Russia to Germany over their stance on the issue as they do against the United States, for example?
Good question. I mean, you could say in a sentence, Russia's strategy towards Ukraine has been to try to peel Germany away from Russia. Perfectly legitimate. Actually a smart strategy. Rational strategy. Angela Merkel was in D.C. last year. They held a long press conference with Barack Obama that was watched very carefully in European capitals and in Moscow for almost an hour, where they talked specifically about Ukraine. Last June, June 2015. And what you could see in that performance was the standards by which they assessed Western policy towards Russia and Ukraine. So, and there was shifts in let's talk about the commonalities. Both said very clearly, and that was controversial in the United States, much more so than in Germany. Germany was like, yeah, that's obvious, but in the United States it was controversial. There is no military solution to the Ukraine crisis. So Obama just said, that's the start. We begin there, right? So for a German chancellor to say that is, yeah, that makes sense. Vernünftig, you would say in German. Yeah, that's logical, right? But they hedged onto possibly supplying Ukraine with defensive weapon systems. Obama was sort of like, no decision made, but it's a possibility. But when you listen to him and read the text, you could see probably not. And same for Merkel. So what Putin has been trying to do since then is sort of a hot-cold treatment of, what we see in terms of the DNC and who the hackers are or information issues. We see very robustly in Germany. The German parliament, the Bundestag, has been hacked, all parties, information stolen. And what's interesting to see is the German security officials are now not reticent to say we have a very strong idea where this is originating. It's state-driven, in the language, it's state-driven. And so that's what I meant in part by hybrid warfare, a combination of information strategies, military strategies, and an effort to both sort of woo and not intimidate, but to influence, I should say, German decision making. Again, you can say completely irrational behavior from in terms of Moscow and Russian politics depending on how you want to debate and look at that. Again, that's why I said at the beginning, Germany is the gateway. This goes back into the Cold War. There's several initiatives by the Soviet Union to create a neutral Germany at the heart of Europe, and part of it is sort of a Eurasian security architecture, right? And there was a lot of support for that in different political classes in Germany. Neutrality, but sovereign, independence and sovereignty. And you see those efforts today as well, in terms of new type of Eurasian security architecture, SON, the USA, and things like that. But I would say the political interest in those exercises is completely gone now because of Ukraine and Syria in the German political class. It's not coming back anytime soon. So what you see is, like I said, a rational effort by Moscow to try to, classic conquer, divide and conquer, or separate and weaken. That's seen as a rational effort to increase influence and to weaken, an opponent. It's also done with promises of different types of commercial contracts and the Russian market. So it's a little bit of a Chinese strategy involved there. If you help us help ourselves, we can help you with enormous possibilities in terms of energy politics, railroad, auto, a whole list of things. So Washington is watching that very carefully, how Berlin continues to evolve its Russian politics. And you see many similarities with the Cold War in terms, again, Germany being a linchpin in the competition, also between Russia and the United States. If you're looking at the chessboard, to use a chessboard metaphor, maybe Germany's not the king, might be the queen. It's definitely at least a castle, and maybe even two castles as opposed to a queen. And that's what's at stake here. That's how Berlin understands it. That's how DC sees it, and Moscow sees it too.
Well, perhaps we'll end on that image of our two castles, and join me in thanking our guest again.